We're talking about the good, official, hardworking, well-intentioned kind of journalist. The difference between those folks and the people who are doing brand communications is the difference between telling objective stories and telling stories with an objective.
Stand by. I'll be right there.
Hello and welcome to Minter Dialogue, episode number 376. Today is Sunday the 7th of June 2020. My name is Minter Dial and I'm your host for this podcast. First, a shout out and thanks to Playful Author for putting up a 5-star review on the show. This week's interview is with Melanie Deziel. Melanie's the founder and chief content officer of StoryFuel. She's the author of the Content Fuel Framework, How to Generate Unlimited Story Ideas. She's also an international keynote speaker of great renown, recognized as one of the world's leading experts in native advertising and branded content. In this chat with Melanie, we discuss what it means to think like a journalist when you're a marketer, the relationship between storytelling and content, looking at some of the key and insightful elements of her new book, how to come up with 100 pieces of content for your brand using focus and format, and the notion of content bankruptcy. You'll find all the show notes on minterdial.com as usual, and as ratings and reviews are the lifeblood of any podcast, please consider going to this handy all-in-one ratethispodcast.com/MDIAL to drop in your review. And certainly don't forget to subscribe to catch all the future episodes. Now for the interview. Melanie Deziel, great to have you on the show. You are a fellow write and ranter, author of a book that I plunged into and devoured called The Content Fuel. What, in your words, how would you like to describe yourself?
This is a good question. I have historically described myself as a speaker, and we're in an interesting time, in the midst of recording this where events are not happening. So I've actually, reckoning with this myself at the moment. But I'm a lifelong storyteller, and I really feel like my mission and all the things that I do is to try to bring that love of telling stories to others, primarily marketers, which is why I've done a lot of speaking at conferences. But I'm also an educator. I've done worked as an adjunct professor. I have, taught workshops in a corporate environment. And now this book hopefully allows me to teach as many people as I can reach.
One of the fun things I had in sort of layering into who is Melanie Deziel was unpeeling the notion of your journalistic background and how that obviously flavors what you're doing today. And then you did this master's in digital education, which is also fascinating because it's something I got luckily into. I used to work at a company called L'Oreal, and I ran a brand for them called Redken. And Redken, which is a hairdresser brand, they do a lot of education, and actually got this chance within a corporate environment to do storytelling through digital and through education. Because at the end of the day, I've always thought that education, which is obviously one of the other formats you talk about, is a way to tell stories.
Yeah, absolutely. When I studied, my master's was in arts and cultural criticism. I studied writing. But really, I feel like so much of the mission of journalism, of creating content, is in educating. We're acting on behalf of our audience to interview, to collect information, to dig deeper, and then turn that around and give it to others as a way to help them feel as informed or as entertained as we had the privilege to be. And, like I said, I became obsessed with storytelling, with journalism, with investigating. I mean, that was my love for so long when I was studying it. And so to find a way to help share that with others has been very rewarding for me. My favorite part of my job in any respect, whether it's on stage, in a workshop, one-on-one environment, is if I can get someone who comes into that room or into that conversation thinking, well, I'm not a creative, I'm not a storyteller, that's not me. And they walk out saying, oh, I've got so many ideas, I can't wait to dig into that. That for me is the most rewarding thing. It means I got someone else to catch that bug, and they're going to start asking big questions and digging into things and, unearthing stories that haven't been told before or haven't been told in that way before. And so for me, that's like the most rewarding part. I guess I'm sort of like a missionary preaching the word of journalism. And so when I get people on my side, it feels really good.
It makes me think of this notion of investigation. And you talked about sort of uncovering the storytelling bug. I also think about the uncovering of the investigative bug. And I don't know if there's a real link exactly, because afterwards you know what you're doing with the investigation is then you have to relate that back. But it feels for me that sometimes, you know, when you're really investigative, you kind of have to almost go undercover. You have to go beyond the first layers to peel back the stories. You know, when a cop is interviewing somebody, they're not necessarily going to tell you the story that favors them, right?
Mm,
The person who's being interviewed or
right.
investigated. And so as a journalist, you're also in that kind of a thing. And I was just wondering, is there a bug within that as well? Or can there be things that sort of turn you off and say, oh, danger?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's different for everybody. I think we all catch whatever part of the bug, is right for us. There are some who are, wonderful satire writers, and that's their whole livelihood, and they're amazing at conveying messages in that way. I think for those of us who catch the investigative bug, there's a little bit of an obsessive quality. Those are the people who are, I mean, unfortunately, and we see this throughout culture, these are the folks who are often subject to addictions of various kinds, and it's
Mm.
because we can get very single-minded about something. And so, just an example, you see that there's some sort of injustice happening, something doesn't feel right to you, it seems like this shouldn't be this way. You almost cannot stop. It's compulsive until I figure out why, until I find the answer. And as happens so many times, the deeper you dig, the more questions you find. Well, why was the funding allocated in this way? Well, who's in charge of the funding? Well, how did they get that role? And it's sort of, you end up with what you see it in films all the time, or in television shows. Someone's in a darkened room with strings running all across, pictures hung here and charts over here. And it can feel very much that way when you're in the midst of it.
That's sort I think it's sort of almost like solving puzzles,
Yeah.
and there's always incomplete information. What you write about, what you tell on your site, you talk about think like journalists, and I was just wondering, can you unpack that for me? If I'm a brand,
Yeah.
what does it actually mean to think like a journalist?
So I always say that the difference between communication that good journalists, and I'll give that caveat, right? We're talking about the good, official, hardworking, well-intentioned kind of journalists. The difference between those folks and the people who are doing brand communications is the difference between telling objective stories and telling stories with an objective, right? So if you're a brand, that story has a meaning behind. There's an intention. I want you to believe this thing, or buy this product, or come to our event. Whereas in journalism, generally speaking, and there are, of course, exceptions to the rule, but you're not trying to convince your audience to do anything. You're trying to give them enough information to come to a conclusion on their own. I'm not telling you who to vote for. That would be an opinion piece. I'm just telling you, here's what we've learned about this particular candidate, right? So I think there are some elements of both that are helpful. And obviously, if you're working on the brand side, the marketing side, you do need to have an objective. You have to have business goals and be creating content for a purpose. But there's often value at the level of an individual content piece to back away from that product and think about it a bit more objectively, because it can be so much more compelling. So there's a number of ways you can do that. One of the things I talk about very often is including reputable sources. Any journalist worth their salt knows you don't tell the audience what you think or feel. You find people who are qualified and informed to tell the audience what they think and feel, right? It's not about my feelings. It's about the scientists or the experts or the people inside this particular organization. And so oftentimes we forget to do that very same thing on the brand side, where we're quoting just our executives all the time. We're never looking to outside sources, or we're making big sweeping claims about trends or product efficiency or an industry as a whole without asking a scientist, a sociologist, a professor of some kind to come in and validate those big claims. And when we do that, we create so much more trust with our audience, right? So, finding reputable sources is one of the easiest ways you can take that content and make it a bit more objective, a bit more trustworthy right off the bat.
I love the way you unveil that, Melanie, because the narrative in my mind, just to this point of thinking like a journalist, because the issue, and we were talking about this just beforehand, which is there was a wall. There used to be a very fixed wall between editor and publisher side. and one was just to do the stories, and the other one was to sell the stories, if you will, make money.
Yeah.
And it turned out that became a very hard wall to keep up because, well,
Right.
media papers are going out of business. And the other side, well, the brand, they necessarily might have objectives that look like selling. And the more that selling smells like selling, the less powerful and influential it is. So
Right.
just like when a journalist becomes more of a, let's say, I don't know the kind word, but a sucker for the sale, if you will, to use the nicest way
Yeah.
I can come up with, um, that then doesn't look like as much have integrity when you're a
Right.
journalist. And it kind of feels like that also is a learning for both sides, because at the end of the day, a newspaper that's dead, i.e. not selling, no good.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I remember there was a time in the journalism world where, like you said, with that wall, you could be separated from how your organization was run and how it made money. You turned in your copy and you were on to the next story. And I think the digitization of media has made it so that that process doesn't end when you hand in your story. Now it's your job to also help make sure the story looks good. It's your job to help coordinate with a photographer or a designer. It's your job to share it out on social media and make sure people actually read it. And so we no longer have that liberty in the journalism world of being separate from the business of journalism as well. And, you do need necessary separation to maintain integrity, but we can't be blind to it. We can't turn a blind eye to it anymore. And I think the inverse is also true. There was a time when businesses could just, create their ad and send it out to the agency, and that was the end of the day, right? But now the digitization means we have a more personal one-on-one connection with our audience through social media, through our blogs, through all the content we create as brands. And so we no longer have the liberty of just thinking about the sale. We also need to create something worthy of subscribing to, following, engaging with, watching, reading, etc. And so to do that, we need to occasionally at least back away from our product and have a broader conversation, because people aren't going to sign up for the most part to just receive sale messaging. We don't want to be pitched, every day, every minute, every email or post we see. And so we need to find a way to help that medicine go down a little easier, with sprinkle some sugar in there.
And the thing that I think kind of maybe must have been a motor beside both of those movements is social media. Because on the one hand, the paper was being sold in a kiosk and the journalist wrote it and had a byline. And then there's this thing called comments that the internet allowed. And well, I'm not going to read that. By gum, that's them reading it. And then you ended up having to have a Twitter profile, and then people might comment to you, well, you
Yeah.
wrote this, and well, I'm not going to respond to that. But if you do respond to it in an interesting way, that might help you get more clicks back in. Oh,
Yeah.
Godfathers. And then on the brand side, you were spewing out stuff, and yet the social element, the human story side, is what you're going to spread to your network. And all of a sudden, I have to soften. I just feel like in both sides, it had different kind of roles.
Well, it's shifted in both cases from broadcast to a conversation, right?
Mm.
There was a world where we could just put information out, and what people did with it, they did with it. And now they're telling us what they're doing with it, or what they do and don't like about it, or what they want to see more of and less of. And so it's raised the stakes a little bit. We've got to work a little bit harder to be worthy of their attention. And it's also, it also plugs into the broader conversation of the glut of content that exists now, how easy it is to create. The competition is much, much fiercer now to get someone's attention and to be worthy of reading. And so, we're not just competing with other journalists, we're competing with brands too. And brands are competing with journalists. We're competing with Facebook. We're competing with Google. It's
And
all of us
bloggers.
are. Exactly. Yeah. I mean, and Candy Crush on your phone. It's like we're all competing for the same 24 hours a day. And so the bar is now higher to be worthy of someone's time and attention.
All right. So this brings up this notion of creating content. So we've just determined that there is a lot of content out there. What made you want to come up with the content fuel book? Yeah.
So the content fuel framework was born out of requests that I was getting from clients, from people that I was working with. It's one of those situations where you're not even really sure how you do something, but you need
Mm.
to figure it out. And so in a way, I guess became obsessive about investigating how my brain was working. I would be in these environments with clients and they'd say, okay, we need to come up with ideas for such and such product or event. And my brain would light up. I'd say, yeah, we could do a video about this. We'll go behind the scenes and do this. We'll do a long form piece on this. We'll look at the data, and I could, roll out ideas like it was incredibly easy, and I couldn't explain how or why. And if I didn't know how or why I was doing it, I couldn't tell someone else how to do it. And so the book was really born out of a lot of reflection and introspection and trying to figure out what is happening in my head when these ideas are seemingly popping out of thin air, and how do I turn that into something I can teach others how to do. And so that's really what the book is me saying, after a lot of reflection, here's what I've come up with. My brain asks, how do I answer this question? And here's some ways you might. And how does it answer this question? And here are some ways you might. And so if you combine those things, you come up with, the promise of the book is hundreds of ideas using this framework anytime you need it. And so it really was just very, very driven by trying to figure out, where do my ideas come from?
Mm.
Because I can't explain it, and that's not acceptable to me.
Right.
So once I figured it out, I just had to put it on paper.
Well, I love that you explained it that way, Melanie, because I absolutely wanted to figure out how on earth you came up with them. Because it's just that it doesn't feel like there's well, this is how it is kind of place. You actually have to craft these ideas. And the terms you use were really, for me, kind of intuitively different. And so I just love the ideas, people, history, process, curation, example, opinion, in terms of focuses, and then in the formats, and I'm just reading them as I to remember them. But you, along with writing, audio, and video, you include image gallery, timeline, quiz, tool, and map. And I was thinking, if I had to do that, I would be petrified, because I don't know how I would base my decision. I mean, you clearly have a strong connection with, how the wires in your brain are working to be able to come up with that, because it just felt like, whoa, where do you stop? And then, with the new
Yeah.
technologies as well coming in there, it just seems
Yeah.
like so many.
Well, that was the big challenge. I mean, I think in a way I was tasking myself with codifying the way we talk about content, and that's a big challenge. So I wanted to try to be as humble and honest as I could in doing that, in that exercise. And so I even say in the book, look, these may not be the right categories for you. Maybe your specific business, your specific resources demand that you don't use some of these, or that you use others, and that's fine. But this is what works for me. And since I figured this out, I've been teaching it in workshops, I've been sharing it on stage, and it's worked for a lot of other people too. So it's not just my own system. It's actually
Sure.
proven to be helpful. But yeah, there was quite a few moments of, renaming some of the categories, because the way I think of, people at one point was called profile. And I realized that's a very journalistic term. And it's much more clear if I just say people focused stories instead of profile. So, there was a lot of that sort of back and forth, figuring out how do we make this accessible especially for someone who maybe doesn't come from a content background of any kind. So a lot of naming. And then again, like you said, where do I stop? And so I think that was easiest with the formats. What I decided is that I wanted the formats to be platform agnostic. So, there's easily a world where it could have said tweet and Facebook post
Right.
and Pinterest post, but that's not necessarily helpful, I don't think. You don't want to think in a platform specific way, because most of us are not platform specific, right? We have a presence across all these different places. And so I tried to break it down to its most basic parts, like writing, imagery, audio, video, trying to really get down to the ingredients, which could then be, put in different places. And that's where we landed on. After the formats, there's a chapter on how to evaluate new formats that arise, because I can't
VR.
account. Yeah, I mean, we can talk about VR and augmented reality and gaming, right? Brands are creating games now. But I didn't want to leave people hanging, to say, if it's not one of these, I can't help you. So I use sort of, these are the questions that I use when I'm evaluating whether a new format is useful for us as an
Mm.
organization or as an entity. What questions should you ask? What things should you examine before you just dive into the shiny new object?
And when you say we, I'm guessing you mean Trina White and the gang at page 2. Is that possible?
Yeah, I mean, Trina Light and the team at Page Two were the ones who helped bring the book to life and take it from, a Google Doc into a real book, which is, incredibly grateful for that. But truthfully, a lot of this book was fully baked when I kind of came to Trina and the team. I had a magnificent editor who I worked with to finalize some of the language and fine tune things, obviously. But I've been teaching the content fuel framework in workshops and sharing it on
Mm.
stage for the better part of the last couple of years. And so it's been refined over time through
Mm.
sharing it and
I
teaching it
see.
with others, hearing their feedback. So
It's more
it
like a
really was,
collective we in some
yeah,
regard. When
yep,
the book, so for having worked with them myself on one book and considering the different formats that a book can take,
yeah,
you've got almost a matricial series of elements to your book. In other words, so you have the different formats, and then you have clickable links that go to the site that have more links that can go to more curated options. So I'm also almost felt like it was labyrinthine, or at least endlessly possible. You just go from one to one to one, and so that
yeah.
must have been a hard thing to map out. Speaking of mapping.
It was a lot of spreadsheets, I'll be honest with you. Yeah, so one of the things I wanted to do is I wanted to make sure that if I was hopefully inspiring people to want to start creating in a new format, I didn't want to just say, okay, good luck, go forth and create. I wanted to try to provide as many resources and helpful things as I could. So yeah, every focus or format chapter where I'm teaching you a new way to tell a story does include a landing page on my website. The links are all in the book. And those landing pages include, as you said, there's curated Pinterest boards with examples. There's
Which, by the
you,
way, there's one of them I absolutely just another rabbit hole, and a Pinterest board about the world of podcasting, and I'm like, oh God, I have to read all of these. Oh no.
yeah. Well, and then there's also, I created Amazon like idea lists so that if you were looking for equipment or, instructional books or other tools that you may need, you can go there, software. I created, YouTube playlists of tutorial based information, to help you learn how to edit your podcast or learn how to shoot video. So I really tried to curate and connect as many dots as I could. And, in full transparency, that's still happening right now. I'm working on a new massive spreadsheet of tool suggestions. I didn't want to put those tools in the book because, as we all know, softwares and tools kind of come in and out of vogue and they're decommissioned and updated. So we're working on creating a sort of repository online. So it'll say, if you're looking to get into podcasting, here are some of the platforms you might need to check out, the softwares you should try. And same thing for video, for infographics, etc. So, I envision it as a living experience. The book may be printed and as it is, but we're always going to be looking for new ways to add more learning into that entire environment.
Well, and I was just thinking of a small sub benefit of working with Page Two is that they have a faster turnaround than traditional publishing houses. So the time decay of all those links and all those things you do put in there. I mean, obviously you have sort of more like evergreen type of links in the
Yeah.
book, but I was just thinking, I just imagining myself in your position, Melanie, putting all that together. One of my favorite, of course, formats you talk about is audio. And, I've got this event that I'm putting on. And so I'm particularly interested in the idea of audio, but I see a lot of resistance in brands to get into podcasting per se. And it made me think of what are the resistances that exist within brands to really go to storytelling, as opposed to flogging my next, widget or
Yeah.
250 ml shampoo. It seems, I don't know if there's a relationship between the resistance of doing branded podcasts or brand infused podcasts and doing storytelling in general. Do you see any links, or what does that tell you?
I think one of the challenges that at least the brands that I've worked with, one of their hangups when it comes to audio is I think compared to many of the other formats, it's not as trackable and it's not as easily fit into their existing spreadsheets, right? It's measured and evaluated in a very different way. And so, video is relatable because they're making commercials. Blogs are relatable because they're writing copy for their website. But when it comes to creating audio content, this is often an entirely new format, which means they're not sure how to evaluate it. They're not sure how to know whether it's working or not. They may not have the talent in-house to even create it, know where to start. And so I think it often feels like a departure. And the fact that as I'm sure you've experienced, you don't get as much of the data from the necessary partners that you have to have in rolling out a podcast across iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, et cetera. You don't always get the same level of data as you do for a typical ad environment where they know everything, where people spent their time on the page, how much time. It's a little bit more difficult for them, I think, to feel comfortable making that investment when it's unclear how they'll know whether it's paying off for them. So that's one of the key concerns that I see with
Mm.
audio. And I think the other thing is there's also creating audio content is a challenge because you don't have the comfort of resting on your laurels. It's not like writing a blog post where you could put some nice design behind it. You could put some fancy photos on the page and distract from the fact that maybe it's not the best quality writing. I mean, with audio, it sort of stands alone. You really have to have high quality sound. You have to have compelling interviewers. You have to have compelling topics, and you can't hide behind sizzle. You really need to create something worth listening to, and that makes it a little bit more intimidating, I think, from a storytelling perspective.
I love that. Thank you for those insights, Melanie. The other formats you talk about are video and live video as two separate instances, and of course they are, because I also think that live video suffers from that same element because, well, you're using other elements like visual, but it's me, and it's
Yeah.
warts and all. And if I say a few too many times, or whatever my issue is in a visual component, it's kind of more authentic, I feel, live video.
Yeah.
While you can always do post-production in audio in the podcasts, the
Hmm.
live video is more authentic. Do you have like a hierarchy in Melanie's mind to these formats and topics?
I would say it's tough to create a single hierarchy because I think it's different for everyone. I like to say that everyone has their own first content language. So, for you, maybe I know you love audio. Audio is where you feel most comfortable, you create most prolifically.
I have
You
a
know, you
face
you
for audio,
feel
you know that.
but everyone has their own comfort level. Some people really love speaking. Others would be very intimidated by the idea of having to do an interview like this. Others, are very comfortable writing, but would never want to appear on video. And others would say, look, I'll be on video all day, but please don't make me write the show notes myself. So it just depends on your own strengths, I think, where you want to start and where your comfort level is. So I don't think there's a single hierarchy. What I would say is, I think writing is the most transferable format, that if you can create good written content, that can become many other things. And I also say that video or live video, whatever you're comfortable with, is a super format, and that creating video content allows you to break it down into audio, visuals, and written content using your transcript. So I think that's one of the situations where if you have limited resources and can only create one thing, I'd recommend that one thing be video, because from that single video, you can create audio, you can create written content that lives on your site. So those are sort of the two rules that I see most often.
This notion of repurposing, right?
Yeah.
Fantastic. One last thing, which is you mentioned it's a footnote in your book, which is this thing of content bankruptcy. What a fantastic word! And so you talk about this notion of cleaning out everything, getting rid of all your email subscriptions and all this, and I couldn't help but thinking about things like all the tabs on my browser. And you talk
Yeah,
about getting rid of your stack of books on the bookshelf, but bloody hell, you have the ones downloaded in your Kindle, you've got your
that
Audible
too.
books, and it's just over the top. So you clean out. Now the question, Melanie, is what secret do you have for getting the right sources? How do you curate, get back in and create the right ones for next year?
Yeah. I think for myself, just, and this is part of what that footnote was about, I was admitting that, my eyes are sometimes bigger than my stomach when it comes to content. I have books that I don't have, more books than I could probably read. I've got more music than I could listen to, and that's wonderful. Like how blessed we are to be able to do that, right? I fully recognize that. But I think sometimes it becomes a burden for me. I start to feel stressed by, oh gosh, I haven't caught up on these books. I have so many things to do, and it feels overwhelming to me. So the content bankruptcy is, and it happens not all at once, but in small parts. When my email starts to feel overwhelming, I'll go and do a big unsubscribe. When my bookshelf starts to overflow, I'll bring a box for donation or give some to friends. So I think it's important to recognize whatever level, when your content ceases to be informative and starts to be stressful, there's a point where you probably need to do some cleaning out, some spring cleaning of your content inboxes, wherever those are. For me, a big part of it comes down to acknowledging what was I actually engaging with of the stuff that I had. And so, I get a lot of books, like I said, many are sent to me by folks who, want me to read it or review it or whatever else. Acknowledging that certain books that I get, even if I aspirationally would like to be the kind of person who reads that book, it doesn't interest me, it doesn't hold my attention, or it will never make it to the top of my list because other things that are more compelling will always supersede it. So in that instance, it's saying, well, what are the topics that always move right to the top? I'll just be very open. I have bought biographies or autobiographies of the most incredible, amazing, inspiring people. And I always will read social science, psychology, or business first. So it's not that I don't love these individuals and want to learn more about their lives, but it always feels more pressing to get into those other topics. And so telling myself, maybe I love that biography, maybe I wait, maybe that's not something I need to buy now because it'll get added to the bottom of the list instead of the top. So I think really kind of critically examining your own content consumption habits to see what are the things that are worth your time, what are the things that do bring you joy, that do inspire you, and I think the other thing I always encourage people to do is make sure you have a diversity of inputs as best you can. It's very easy, without even recognizing it, to find yourself consuming the same types of things created by the same types of people. And when you do that, you create knowledge gaps in your world that you don't even realize are there. And that can be a huge liability. So, make sure that you're not reading only books in the same exact tiny genre or written by people with the same background or written by the same types of people. You want to get a diversity of perspectives to make sure that you're not missing out on things that could be even more inspiring for you.
Melanie, words well expressed. I feel like I've learned tons listening to you. You very much, I think, exhibit that journalistic type of mind where you're very clear about what you're saying. And that is also really useful and the other thing about the written word that's useful, of course, is that it's good for Google because it knows how to pick up words that are written, even if they're in, underneath a video, so on. So, right. Melanie, how can someone learn more about you, connect, get your book, of course, books?
Yeah.
Really see it with the workbook and all that, and the ongoing journey.
The whole experience. So my organization is called StoryFuel. StoryFuel.co is our website. So StoryFuel.co. If you go there, there's a tab for the book. If you want to go straight there, it's contentfuelframework.com. That'll bring you right over to the book. And you can find out more information on our website on storyfuel.co about how to contact me if you're interested in that, about our masterminds, our coaching, our consulting, when the world restarts again, how to bring me into a conference if that's of interest. But you can find all that at storyfuel.co.
Beautiful. Melanie, thank you a million. That was wonderful fun.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks for having listened to this recording of the Minter Dialogue Show. You'll find the show notes and other blog posts on minterdial.com. If you enjoyed the show, please head over to iTunes to give a rating and review. And to finish, here's a song I wrote with Stephanie Singer, A Convinced Man.
won't toe the line. I sit here passively, hope for your respect, anticipating the thrill of your intellect. Maybe I tell myself there's no use in me lying. I'm a convinced man building an urge. I'm a convinced man to live and die submerged. A convinced man in the arms of a woman. I'm a convinced man, challenge my fate. I'm a convinced man, competition's innate. A convinced man in the arms of a woman. Despise revenges and struggle to see. Live for the challenge so life's not incomplete. What's wrong with challenge? I know soon we all die. I like the feel of a stranger tucked around me, precipitating the danger to feel free, trusting my reason.